coming off their first loss of the season, the Eagles look to bounce back against Jonathon Taylor and the Colts. How can the Birds slow down the aforementioned Taylor and get it back on track out in Indy? This episode of the Philly Sports Spot YouTube channel starts right now. Everybody, and welcome into this edition of the Philly Sports Spot YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jordan Hirsch, and now guys, before we get into this video, please make sure you like this video and subscribe to my channel with notifications turned on so you never miss another upload, and also make sure you follow me on Instagram. The link will be in the description below. The Eagles were handed their first loss of the season last week on Monday Night Football against the Washington Commanders as the Eagles went down 32-21. Just too many bad things happened in that game, I really think, for the Eagles to be able to pull out a win. They turned the ball over 4 times. Coming into that game, they just had 3 turnovers all season, so they eclipsed that mark in one single game. Hard to win when you turn it over that many times, obviously. Of course, the refs did not help out the Eagles, but I don't think you could really blame the refs that much. The Eagles, with those turnovers, the one big one, of course, was the Quez Watkins one late in the game, as the Eagles still had a chance to win the game. But I think the biggest factor in the game was the Commanders held the ball for about 40 minutes in this game, and it's really hard to win when your opponent has the ball for 2/3 of the time, and most of that was because of Washington's run game. They were basically able to do whatever they wanted against the Eagles' defensive line, which had no answers. The Eagles really had no answers for Washington's run game. They had no answers for the Texans' run game the week before. They were able to get out of Houston with a win, but gave up 168 yards on the ground, most of which was to Dameon Pierce, a rookie. And the Eagles gave up 152 yards on the ground this past week against the Commanders. Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson accounted for most of those yards. Robinson with 86, Gibson with 44. And the Eagles have really had no run defense since Jordan Davis went down with that high ankle sprain a few weeks ago against Pittsburgh. And it's really shown. Certainly something that the Eagles are going to have to get better at, especially because if you look at their next 4 games against the Colts, Packers, Titans, and Giants, those are 4 elite running backs in this league that they've got coming up that they're going to have to deal with being Jonathon Taylor, of course, this week. Next week, Aaron Jones and the Packers. The following week against Tennessee, you got to face Derrick Henry, and then Saquon Barkley the next week against the Giants, in which could end up being a huge game. So the Eagles are really going to need some defensive aid on the defensive line spot, really clean up this run defense, and they went, and Howie Roseman went out and tried to do that this week, certainly signing 2 former Pro Bowlers back-to-back days. Linval Joseph, who most recently played last season with the Vikings, Eagles signed him to a 1-year contract, and then followed that up the next day, signing Ndamukong Suh to a 1-year deal. Both of these guys have not played yet this season, so it's going to be interesting to see how the Eagles utilize them, if they utilize them at all, tomorrow in Indy. Nick Sirianni said that he's not going to rush anything with either of these 2 guys. I wouldn't be surprised if both of them sat out. I think definitely Ndamukong Suh will probably sit out most of, if not the entire game tomorrow. We may see a little bit more of Linval Joseph just because he got that extra day of practice. I do think they're both going to suit up and will be available, but I don't really expect either of them to play all that much, if at all, and that could end up being a problem because the Eagles have to face one of, if not the best running back in the league tomorrow, in Jonathon Taylor, who's coming off a huge 147-yard game against the Raiders in a win last week in Vegas. And Jonathon Taylor is really starting to look like that he's turned it on. He did the same thing last season, kind of struggled the first half of the year and was able to find his rhythm in the second half, as Jonathon Taylor averaging about 80 yards a game his last 5. But like I said, that 147-yard game last week against Vegas certainly is very scary if you're an Eagles fan. His team has struggled against the run defense recently, and they haven't really played any elite running backs in those 2 games. They're going to play one this week, and they're going to have to find some way to figure out how to stop him, and while also not letting those Colts wide receivers run wild, because of course you can't sell out against the run, or guys like Michael Pittman are going to have a field day for Indianapolis. It's going to be really interesting to see how Jonathan Gannon schemes this one. We'll see how the Colts start out. I think early in the game is going to be a real good test, because I'm going to assume that the Colts are going to go to Jonathon Taylor early, going to follow that blueprint that the Commanders used on Monday, and try to basically beat the Eagles on the ground. They're going to have to find ways to combat that. Fletcher Cox, probably coming off his worst game of his career last week, is really going to have to step it up. And as well as the rest of the guys, if you're without Linval Joseph, if you're without and Ndamukong Suh. Brandon Graham and Josh Sweat are really going to have to step it up to be able to contain this Indianapolis rushing attack. This game, I think, is going to be a really good gauge just to see where the Eagles are at. Of course, they're going to be coming off their first loss of the season, so we're going to have to see how they respond there. We know pretty much Indianapolis' game plan, at least coming into this game, is going to be to use Jonathon Taylor, and then more Jonathon Taylor. So we're going to really have to see how the Eagles are prepared to handle that and how early in this game goes, because you cannot let the Colts jump out to that lead that I'm sure they're looking for with Taylor on the ground early, and then they could start using their wide receivers a little bit more. So we'll really have to see how Jonathan Gannon handles knowing how a team is going to attack him. I mean, really, you could have looked at the last two games against Houston and Washington and say the only way that they could have beat the Eagles is they had to run the ball and run the ball well, and the Eagles, I'm sure, knew that and weren't really able to do anything, so it's going to be a really good test for this Eagles defense and for Jonathan Gannon. And it's also going to be a really good test because the Eagles are beat up. They've got a plethora now of big players out. Of course, Levante Maddox was put on IR before the game against the Commanders last week. Eagles will now be without Dallas Goedert, as well as he was put on IR, so he's out for the next 4 games off that face mask that wasn't. A.J. Brown, who was really a non-factor, just 1 reception for 7 yards against Washington. He's been dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury, so we'll see how healthy he is going into the game tomorrow. As well, the Eagles are really going to have their hands full. Grant Calcaterra, Jack Stoll, and Tyree Jackson will be the tight ends tomorrow. Really excited to see how Tyree Jackson performs. Of course, he played very well in the preseason last year before having a couple of big injuries end his season last year. And I'm sure that he's going to have a little bit of a revenge on his mind. He played really well, and I'm really excited just to see how the Eagles utilize him and how well he plays tomorrow. Jalen Hurts has proven this season that he will throw to anybody at any time as long as they're open. So I think it's going to be a big game for Tyree Jackson just to see how he responds. It's going to be his first game in a long time as well. And I think a lot of people in the organization are excited about him too. They kind of showed that last season. It'll be interesting to see how the Eagles utilize him and how Tyree Jackson performs tomorrow. Of course, in the receiving area is not going to be the only place that the Eagles are going to miss Dallas Goedert this week. Also going to be blocking and in the run game as well. He's going to be a big loss considering the fact that Indianapolis, they really like to attack defensively. They will blitz a lot. They'll run a 7-8 man box a lot of the time, and it's going to be interesting to see how Stoll, Calcaterra, and Jackson handle that, and if the Eagles can get any type of run game going against a really aggressive Colts defense. Now to my game prediction. Earlier in the season, if you asked me about this game, I would have said, the Eagles are going to run right over this Colts team. However, now, considering the injuries and considering coming off of the loss last week, I do think this is going to be a much, much tighter game. However, I do not think that the Eagles are going to lose 2 games in a row. So I would say the Eagles defense steps up in a big way. Eagles find a way to win a close 1-possession game. I'll say final score, Eagles 20 and Colts 17. I do think that the major factor in this game, and the X factor, is going to be the Eagles defense. I think that they really step it up and respond. We heard a lot of them talking in the locker room, especially Brandon Graham after the loss on Monday, just saying how that loss was on them and they had to step it up. And I really think that these guys, bunch of veterans, they're going to respond. I think they're going to respond in a big way. The Colts offense minus Jonathon Taylor is really not very scary. Of course, Michael Pittman's really their only threat at wide receiver. Matt Ryan's going to be starting again for the Colts at quarterback, and Jeff Saturday, the new head coach there in Indianapolis, we'll see how his game plan is against the Eagles defense. So I do think that the Eagles defense steps it up. I think that they're going to be the X factor in this game. I think they come up with maybe a big stop late in the 4th quarter, and the Eagles are able to get out of Indy with the win and get back on the winning track. If you guys have made it this far, comment down below your score prediction for this game tomorrow between the Eagles and the Colts, and who you think the X factor is going to be. That's going to wrap things up for this edition of the Philly Sports Spot YouTube channel. Again, make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to my channel with notifications turned on so you never miss another upload. I post every Saturday. Make sure you guys are also following me on Instagram. Again, the link will be in the description below, or you can just look me up. It's at Philly Sports Spot. That's PHILLYSPORTSPOT, so just one S between sport and spot. Next week, guys, let's go Birds. Let's get back on the winning track this week.